Okay. Hey everyone. So recently I've just been reading through the book of Jeremiah, and it's part of a Bible study that I'm doing with a couple of friends. And, uh, I've just been reading about the Israelite exile and the prophecies of both punishment and restoration. And one of the questions that I've been trying to explore is what is the significance? What is the meaning behind these major events and these prophecies? So so how it's been laid out in a general reduced version is we have prophecies of destruction, where God says, because you have sinned against me, I will desolate the land, I will send you into exile, I will hand you over to your enemies for 70 years. And then immediately following such descriptions, it says, one day I will show compassion on you and I will bring my people back to the land that I've promised them. And in that day, there will be no suffering, no sorrow, and there will be complete flourishing. It is this picture of completeness, of complete paradise, a perfect picture. And then interestingly, scattered amidst, scattered throughout those promises comes descriptions of the Messiah, the righteous branch, the son of David, the one who will sit on the throne of Jerusalem. My righteous servant will rise up and lead my people to freedom, that kind of thing. And just looking at those things as a whole, got me wondering, what does this mean? And that's the main thing that I'm trying to explore in this video. And so I guess let me start this way by describing how it's commonly approached in Protestant circles. So when it comes to a lot of these prophecies in Scripture, especially among the prophetic books, there's this common interpretation, a method of interpretation, especially among Protestant circles, that is this idea of the already and the not yet, right? So we may come across a prophecy that is presented to us as one complete thing, as one idea, that on the surface might seem like all these different elements will happen at the same time, if that makes sense. But that in this idea of the already and the not yet, we would take such a prophecy and dissect it into different time periods. Like this part of the prophecy will be fulfilled in this point. So this part has already been fulfilled. This part is being fulfilled currently, and this other part will be fulfilled in the future. And so is this common practice of dissecting. And so when we look at the promise of restoration in Jeremiah, where it says, after 70 years, I will bring my people back to the land. I will have compassion over them. And in that day, it describes this restoration that is so complete that there will be no pain and suffering. And then, in the midst of that, it describes the coming of the Messiah. And so the approach, the common approach to such descriptions would say, okay, so there's a part of it that is talking about the immediate return of the Israelites after the exile. So that has already been fulfilled. And then there's And then there's the part that's talking about the Messiah that will happen sometime later. And then there's other part of the prophecy, namely how the paradisal, the image of paradise in the prophecy is probably referring to the second coming of Christ, to the future, because things aren't perfect. Things aren't as perfect as is described here. So there's no way it could be referring to now or sometime in the past. It's got to be sometime in the future. It's got to be the second coming. And so that approach would dissect these prophecies into different parts. But for the purposes of what I'm trying to explore now in this video, I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to try to look at these things as a whole, as one thing, as something pointing to one idea. And I'm going to explore what that idea is. So to understand the meaning of the restoration, we have to understand the meaning of the exile, of the desolation. To understand the meaning of the restoration, we have to understand the meaning of the desolation. So let's start there. What's the reason behind the exile? Well, obviously, it's because the people rebelled against God. Despite the many prophets that came to rebuke them and point them towards God, they did not listen. They continued about their own ways. They rejected the commandments, and therefore, as punishment, they're destroyed. Cool. Simple, right? Well, let's look at this psychologically or metaphysically. If God is the unifying spirit, right, at the top of your value hierarchy. So you have a value structure, and this is a big idea from Jordan Peterson. If you have a value structure that is ordered in a certain way, to have it ordered properly, you have to have something at the top, right, of your pyramid. The thing at the top of the pyramid will determine the order of everything else beneath it, right? Now, the question of whether what you put at the top should be at the top, that's a whole other question. But the fact remains that there has to be something at the top. And in a value structure that is properly put together, that is properly ordered, and using the Augustinian phrase, ordered loves, where your loves are properly ordered in their proper place. The thing that's at the top, which I would describe as the ordering principle or the unifying spirit, that is God, whatever God is. So what happens if you get rid of God, right? So if God is the thing at the top of your hierarchy and you get rid of that, then your value structure disintegrates. And what you end up with is something like a polytheism, a kind of polytheism where you have multiple gods of equal stature vying for your attention and worship. So it's like having a, metaphorically speaking, a pantheon of gods without a top god to keep them in order, to put them in their proper place, right? And what happens when you experience this disintegration of your value structure and you have these various things vying for your worship is that you end up being you end up being fractured, spiritually and psychologically fractured. Right. So when you're in this fractured state of being, you are at the whim of whatever is the dominant spirit of the time. Whatever is the prevailing spirit of the time, you are blown at a whim in whichever direction you find yourself in. It's like being a ship out on the open sea with no compass, with no purpose, and allowing yourself to be blown by whichever wind shows up. That's what it's like to be psychologically fractured, when you don't have a unifying principle to point you in a proper direction. That's what happens when you get rid of God. Right? It's the death of God, using the Nietzschean phrase. When Nietzsche described the death of God, the consequences of the death of God is that we need to create our own values. We need to find our own direction. And the thing is, we can't do that. We can't do that properly. Okay, so when the Israelites did that, they got rid of God. And so they are therefore spiritually and psychologically fractured, and they are blown by the wind. That we see that in the character of Zedekiah, King Zedekiah, who was king at that time. Right? If you read the story, Zedekiah is, in summary, a man without a spine. He's a man without conviction. So in one episode, someone came to him, someone who did not like Jeremiah and the message that he was giving. Someone came to him and said, "Hey, King Zedekiah, what Jeremiah the prophet is saying is bad. It's harmful for us. It does not help us in the face of the Babylonians. Let's throw him into the pit and leave him to rot. Let's just get rid of him." And Zedekiah was like, "Okay, sure, you go do that." Sometime later, this other guy named Abimelech, who was on Jeremiah's side, who believed in the words of Jeremiah, Abimelech came to King Zedekiah and said, "Hey, what we're doing to Jeremiah, throwing him in the pit, that's not good. We need to save him." And Zedekiah was like, "Sure, go, take some men and pull him out." This guy, Zedekiah, does not have a place to stand on. He has no conviction. Whatever is the popular opinion of the time, that's the way he is leaning. And that is the complete opposite of what God called Jeremiah to be. In chapter 1, God said, "I will make you a bronze wall. And as long as you say what you need to say, as long as you don't back down, you don't cower in the anger that you will experience from the people, I will be with you. But you have to be a man of conviction. Because if you don't," right, in chapter 1, it says, "If you are afraid of them and you don't say what I tell you to say, then I will terrify you before them." Basically, if you don't stand by your conviction, you're just going to be like them. and you're going to experience the terrifying chaos of what it's like to be a person without conviction, just like they were. So Zedekiah is a good example. Zedekiah is a reflection of the spiritual state of the rest of the nation. He is a man without spine. The nation is a nation without spine because they got rid of their unifying spirit at the top of their hierarchy, and they are blown by the wind, which is why they are so appealed to by the gods of the neighboring nations. Whichever is the popular god of the time, we'll take it. Oh, that one's a new god, very popular of the time, we'll take it. And they just assimilate with these different religions around the area. And God is saying, I'm the one you should put before all these other gods. And apparently they're not doing that. Apparently they don't have a top god for their value structure. Because the first commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me. I should be the one at the top. So they're not doing that. They are fractured psychologically. They're blown by the wind with no conviction, without direction. And that's the state that they find themselves in. And Jeremiah is this figure who stands in stark contrast to that spiritual state. And Zedekiah is just a reflection of that. Zedekiah is just a reflection of that aimless, directionless state of being. When you are spiritually and psychologically fractured, you are effectively homeless. You are psychologically homeless. You have nothing to stand on. You are not grounded in anything. And so you're homeless. That, in effect, is the exile. That is what the exile means. Which means that the exile is the physical manifestation of... The exile is an external manifestation of an inward state of being. And that is a theme that we see multiple times throughout the Bible and in other religious stories. And in fairy tales as well, we see this idea that the internal state of being will manifest in the external reality. We see this as an example in the end of Zedekiah's life too, or the last we hear of Zedekiah, when the Babylonians came and took over and they captured Zedekiah and took him as captives. What happens is that the Babylonians killed his son. They killed his sons in front of his eyes and gouged out his eyes, blinding him and leaving him in prison for the rest of his life. So it's no coincidence, I don't think. Literally speaking, metaphorically speaking, it's no coincidence that the consequences he faced in the hands of the Babylonians were that he lost his sons and he lost his eyes. You lose your children, you effectively lose your future. You lose your eyes, you lose your sight. You lose a spiritual sight. So Zedekiah, to be in the state that the Israelites were in, to kill off God from their value structure, required them to have a short-sighted view of life, a short-sighted view of the world. It's a term I like to use is spiritual myopia, a short-sightedness that concerns you with the pleasures of the present moment at the expense of your holistic well-being on the grand scheme of things. You get rid of God. God is the spirit that guides you through life and being and reality. In the grand scheme of things, that's the best way forward. It takes short-sightedness to get rid of that guiding spirit. And so Zedekiah, being a reflection of that spiritual state of being, he was a man of short-sightedness, being someone without conviction, being blown by the wind. He's a man of short-sightedness. And what happens when you are short-sighted is, by definition, you sacrifice the future. By definition, you sacrifice the future for the present. And so that's exactly what happens to him. His spiritual blindness manifested in literal, physical blindness, with his eyes being gouged out. And he lost his sons. He lost his children, effectively losing his future. That's exactly what happens when you are short-sighted. You lose your future because, well, by definition, you sacrifice the future for the present, right? So it's this idea of an internal state of being manifests in the external reality. So for the entire nation of Israel, the internal state of being, of being fractured, being psychologically fractured, manifests in the external reality of being literally homeless, of being in exile. All right? So that's the significance and the meaning behind the exile. So with that, now we can turn to the contrast. The promise of restoration. And in particular, the coming of the Messiah, right? Because apparently this messianic figure is that which brings about paradise, that which brings about this return to home, return to the land that was promised. And in effect, return to this state of integration, of wholeness, psychological and spiritual wholeness, in contrast to what we just talked about. And so the question is, what does this mean? What brings about this wholeness? And how are we to understand the messianic figure? To understand the messianic figure and the restoration, we have to draw from what we understand of the exile. So if the reason for the exile is fracturedness, and fracturedness is the consequence of getting rid of God at the top of your value structure, then the opposite of that is what brings about wholeness. So in the descriptions of Jesus Christ, in the messianic figure that was prophesied, he is described as, with a couple of interesting characteristics. He's described as a servant of God, as humble, right? Meek, gentle, as fully righteous in pursuit of God, and that he bears the sins of the world. He suffers unjustly, and by his stripes we will be healed. Right? So what does that mean? What's that got to do with the exile? What's that got to do with fracturedness and wholeness? One, The first thing we know is that he's the first thing that we find out about this messianic figure is that he is righteous, the righteous branch, the servant of the Lord. To be righteous is to align your life, align every part of yourself in the direction of the highest, right? In the direction of that unifying spirit, of that ordering principle. So, this messianic figure who orders his life in the direction of the transcendent is humble, he is meek, gentle, and he bears the weight of the world, and he suffers unjustly. And he doesn't just suffer unjustly. It is through his suffering that our wholeness is made manifest. How is that so? How is that so? He is meek and gentle, going like a lamb to the slaughter. When he is accused, he did not open his mouth. So it is this idea of voluntarily taking on the suffering. Voluntarily taking on the suffering. Why would you do that? Why would you voluntarily take on unjust suffering? You know, the image of the Messiah and the crucifixion is archetypal in the sense that it is taking the extremes of, like, metaphysical extremes and putting them together to describe a reality. So what that looks like is you have Christ, who is the most innocent, so going to the extreme, right? It's archetypal. The most innocent, the most righteous. This person is the least deserving of anything that is bad. And yet, we have this person suffered the worst possible, in the worst possible way, right? The worst possible things happening to someone who least deserves them. So you have these two extremes happening. And he takes that on willingly. Why? Because he believes that by doing so, you can bring about heaven on earth. That's the idea, right? That by pointing your life in the direction of that which is highest, you kind of attract evil to you, right? Evil seeks to corrupt goodness. When you are someone who is righteous and you walk through this chaotic world, things will happen to you. And the question is, what are you going to do about it? And the right answer that is presented to us in this figure of the Messiah is that you would take that on willingly. If it is suffering that is unjust, because any suffering that's happening to someone who does not deserve it is unjust. Someone who is righteous is unjust. If suffering happens to you as a result of you living out your path forward, your path uphill towards goodness, the best thing you can do is to take that on in its full extent, to the best of your ability. And that can look like taking responsibility for yourself, for your community. Take as much responsibility as you possibly can. You bear the weight of the world, right? The figure of Christ is that he bears the weight of the world. So that's the other extreme, right? The most innocent, suffering the worst way possible. And through that, he bears the ultimate weight of the world. It's so archetypal. It's amazing. And that is just the extreme representation of what we ought to live out in our own lives. That in our effort to live righteously, right, to have God at the top of our value structure, as a result of that, we will experience unjust suffering. And the best thing you can do is to take on that unjust suffering voluntarily. And why would you do that? The same reason why the Messiah did that. Because it is faith. It is faith that doing so is the best way to bring about heaven on earth. And then you might ask, why, how could that bring about heaven on earth? Taking on unjust suffering. Why? How could that bring about heaven on earth? Well, and the answer is, there is no shortage of evil, pain, suffering in the world around us today. No shortage. Everywhere you look, you will find it. And so the question is, how do you bring about heaven on earth? You do that by finding the burden that is yours to bear. Because there is no shortage of evil and suffering in this world. The best way forward is to bear some of that. Now, you can't bear the whole world, right? But you can bear something, and maybe you can bear more than you think you can. And push yourself to the limit, right? There is nothing better. What is better than bearing the most you possibly can of the suffering of the world? Maybe you can't bear a lot at this point, but bear what you can. And when you see that you are able to take on more, then you take on more. And then the question could be, how do I find that burden? How do I find what is mine to bear? And there are a couple answers to that. The simplest answer is whatever is right in front of you. There's no shortage of burdens to bear. There's definitely one in front of you right now. Find that. Pay attention to that. You see it and you bear it. That's the simplest answer. The other answer is the burden that is yours to bear is the one that resonates the most with you. Right? That resonates the most with your soul. So find that. You explore the edges of the universe. Pay attention. It's like Moses, right? Moses is in the desert in Midian. He's a shepherd outside of Egypt, and one day he's just minding his own business, tending to his sheep. And out the corner of his eye, he sees something unusual. It's a burning bush. But the important detail is that he noticed it and he paid attention to it. And he decided to pursue it. He could have ignored it. He could have said, oh, that's weird, and just moved on with his life, and nothing would have changed. But no, Moses noticed something. He paid attention and he pursued it. And that is how he received the call of his life. And it could very well be the same way with you. Be attentive as you go about your life. You know, something out the corner of your eye could be calling to you one day. It might not be much at first, but pay attention. And if you investigate it, if you pursue it, if something calls to your soul and resonates with you and you investigate it, you very well could find the call of your life. And so, doing that will be suffering. You will experience your share of suffering by doing that. But there is nothing better. There's nothing more meaningful, nothing more purposeful than finding the burden that is yours to bear and bearing it to your fullest capability. And you do so because you have faith that on the other side of that by doing so, you manifest what small part of heaven on earth that you can. And if enough people do that, well, we very well could see the advent of heaven. And that's the meaning of the messianic figure, right? And if you do that, you pursue righteousness and you take on the burden of the world, you find yourself psychologically and spiritually integrated and whole because you have a direction, you have a unifying principle that is holding everything together, you have a purpose. And you have a purpose with the faith that you will see the fruits of it. Right? That's the vision that drove the figure of Christ to the cross, the vision of heaven on earth. And that can be the same vision for you as well as you embark on the journey of life. Start with yourself. Start with taking care of yourself. Then start with your family. Then your community. And that's the meaning of this whole picture that we see in Jeremiah. We see what happens when you reject God at the top of your value structure and you experience fracturedness and disintegration. You are spiritually homeless. And the way out of that desert, that exile, is to point yourself towards that which is highest and to take on responsibility and bear the weight of the world in the process with faith. That's the way out of that desolation. And so that whole prophecy is one thing to me. It's describing one idea. And I see that scattered throughout the book. So, anyway, that's a long expounding on my observations in the book of Jeremiah. And hopefully that has been insightful. Yeah. And if you made it this far, I am impressed and proud of you and very grateful. So, I will see you next time.